Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sudha Krishnan. I am the host of CBC Montreal News at 11 on CBC Television in Montreal, and it gives me pleasure to be moderating this discussion, which I hope will be quite a robust discussion with a diverse and talented panel of journalists who have insights to respond to the big question that many of us are asking: where is gender justice in this election, this 44th federal election that is happening in the middle of a pandemic? So I just want to welcome you all, and we'll see if we can touch upon all of these subjects and topics. Of course, this event partnered Up for Debate, partnering with the Canadian Women's Foundation. So it's such a pleasure to be moderating this discussion and looking forward to hearing some of the insights from our talented panel of journalists. So this event is bilingual, so you will want to click on the globe on your right to choose what language you would like to listen to in it. Our panelists can answer the questions in the language of their choice, English or French. We also have captioning available in both English and French. So you want to click on the CC button at the bottom toolbar to turn on the captioning. We will not be taking any audience questions today, but feel free to engage with Up for Debate on their social media accounts to keep the conversation going after the panel. And our Twitter handles are being posted in the chat now in case you need to follow us. So before we begin, it is very important to acknowledge that we are on traditional First Nations, Métis, and Inuit territories. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this land. However, we do recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. We need to pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an ongoing effort to make right with all our relations. Now, today's event is brought to you by Up for Debate. So we will now play a short video so you can learn more about who they are and what they are calling for.
Up for Debate is an alliance of women's rights and gender justice advocates from across the country. Nous sommes féministes et nous sommes partout. The pandemic laid bare how much our economy depends on the paid and unpaid labor of all women, both trans and cis, particularly Black, Indigenous, racialized, and migrant women. Les gains en matière d'égalité des genres sont menacés. And we're done waiting. What's your plan for an intersectional feminist economic recovery? Comment allez-vous surmonter les obstacles systémiques? Will you center women's rights and gender justice in all debates and on the campaign trail? Quand aurons-nous enfin suffisamment de logements abordables? Will you build a national childcare system? Soutenez-vous le plan d'action national sur la violence à l'égard des femmes et la violence fondée sur le genre? Will you do everything necessary to end violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people? As Prime Minister, how will you support our rights and help us achieve gender justice? Nous voulons des réponses and we demand action.
So that says it, and that's one of the reasons why we are here today, because as explained in that video, we're hosting this panel and also as a journalist covering this pandemic over the past 18 months or so. It really did expose and lay bare the extent to which Canada's economy depends on the paid and unpaid labor of women. It also highlighted the fragility of response systems, as well as the urgent need for a structural rethink and systemic change. It really exposed so many vulnerabilities. Many of them were calling this a she session during the pandemic, talking about rebuilding a she economy. That conversation was there. So add to that, gender-based violence increased dramatically in frequency and severity, disproportionately impacting Black, Indigenous, racialized, newcomer, immigrant, refugee, non-status women, two-spirited, LGBTQ and non-binary people, and those living with disabilities. The pandemic also further limited access to supports and services. So the conversation, really, the systemic fault lines heightened by this pandemic revealed deep inequality. And that's meant that many equality issues have come under public discussion as of late. And we've been hearing about it in this general election. The question is, how much have we been hearing about it? Like, we see women pushed out of the workforce, and it's clearer than ever that childcare needs to be seen as essential, not optional. We see the overrepresentation of Black, Indigenous, racialized, and migrant communities among these unemployed during the pandemic and among those contracting COVID-19. And we have seen the precariousness of care jobs. We have seen the racism in our institutions, systemic racism, from police violence to discrimination and barriers when accessing healthcare. And we have seen the identification of unmarked children's graves at former residential school sites. Now, Canada has entered the election period with a host of equity issues that are under discussion, including promises of increased attention on an intersectional feminist economic recovery. The question is, are the parties delivering on these commitments? And with that, we want to dive into many questions. So we're here to highlight gender justice issues in the context of the election to you, the voters listening here today. And to do this, we have an excellent panel of media. Emilie Nicolas is a bilingual Montreal-based anthropologist, human rights advocate, and columnist for Le Devoir, Montreal Gazette, and CBC Radio. She's also a columnist with us on CBC Television. Anuba Momin is a Toronto-based writer, producer, and advocate who, in her spare time, makes viral TikToks about race, gender, and politics. Welcome, Anuba. And Jen Jefferies is an Ottawa-based freelance journalist and co-host of the City and Nujimi podcast. She's served several national Indigenous organizations, including the Native Women's Association of Canada. She's also contributed freelance work to Maclean's Magazine and the Hill Times newspaper, among other publications. So I want to welcome all of you. Great to have you up. So I'm going to be asking the questions to all three of you, and we're going to give each of you about 2 minutes per question. So we can start with Jen. What key gender issues aren't getting attention in this election?
Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Perfect. Well, first, I just want to thank the Canadian Women's Foundation and the Up for Debate group, the coalition of feminist organizations that made this happen today. I'm really humbled and nervous. Hi, Mom, by the way, to be on a panel like this as a super shy, introverted writer, to be honest. Back to your question in terms of what's been missing, all kinds of stuff. I trip over the word diversity because it has been overused and hashtagged to death to the point where it feels hollow at this point. But I'm certainly going to say that that's missing. There's a lot of, I don't know, whenever I used to kind of think my way through certain things, I would go back and read columns from a friend of mine who passed away last year, actually, Anne Kingston. And she wrote a really great column summarizing the 2019 federal election, which feels like it just happened like yesterday. And she wrote a lot about masculinity contests. I feel like that's been happening a lot. There's a whole lot of like references to like boxing and like, I don't know, how buff someone is, how macho they are, just a whole lot of like peacock, like masculinity type stuff. And I think that's, first of all, kind of gross. And second, just like, I don't know, we're just better than that. Like there's so many more issues, like you kind of mentioned in your intro, that we're completely glossing over or missing. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Green Party leaders. She was on the leaders debate. She was invited to the consortium debates. And I think she was probably the breakout star of the entire event, but we know obviously, given that we don't have proportional representation in this country, and the Green Party is considered fringe for some reason. They don't get often as much media coverage as the bigger establishment parties. So, yeah.
Well, anime Paul was talked about a lot, especially in the English language debate, and especially when there was a segment, not only just about childcare, but when there was a segment when they were talking about race and Quebec and systemic racism, and there was an exchange about she inviting the Bloc Québécois leader to educate. So she did have an impact. Emily, I want to ask you what key gender issues aren't getting attention in this election.
I don't know what gender issue is actually taking attention in this election. I would have a hard time thinking of one that we've actually focused on. I feel like gender is actually not a dimension that we've explored at all. We've spoken about things that affect women. I think the one thing that's been spoken of the most is the whole childcare policy. But apart from that, I don't know that we've touched upon anything else. You were right, I think, to mention that chicanery was, a language that was used, for example, in the last federal budget to describe some of the policies they wanted to put forward. But then that's not necessarily a vocabulary that's been used again during the campaign. There was not an attention even on this very short reconciliation conversations that I've seen. It was not specifically focused on Indigenous women and two-spirited people. That's also not what I've seen. And so it seems like, from my personal experience as well, like listening to people who work behind the scenes in political parties, when it comes to a campaign, people think as if women voters are there to, yeah, exactly. Childcare is a way to get women's vote, and then in general, it's more discussed in terms of the tone. If I sound more aggressive, is that going to pull off, women voters and things like that? It's very much more about communication style than it is about the issue. And I think a lot of us have to lose when that's the case. So when we don't talk about violence against women, but yet we speak of, security threat. One of the things that we've talking about in relationship to the campaign is gun control, but we haven't somehow made the connection between that and violence against women. The only connection that's been made is with street gangs, right? Black people, Black youth being dangerous, but there's no connection to people of all background actually assaulting women with said firearms. Like, that's not, so we can see where the Canadian imaginary is at. And I think it's really important, at least I try to do that when I analyze a political campaign, to analyze as much what is said as much as what is not said, because I think the silence sometimes speaks volume.
And that's an excellent point, because in Quebec, in and of itself, I think there at least has been 14 women killed allegedly. I'm only saying allegedly because a lot of these cases are before the courts.
Yeah. No, provincially we've spoken a lot about that, and I think it's maybe also a case in Quebec of like,
that's been an issue across the pandemic. But at the same time, there are 14 women that we know of go into those diverse communities where maybe they're not really talking about it. There could be more, and we don't know.
Absolutely.
So, I want to ask you the very same question. What key gender issues aren't getting attention in this election?
To sort of ping pong off of what Emily said, almost every issue is a women's issue. Almost every issue is a gender issue, because we know that anything that's sort of going wrong for society, it is often women, trans folks, people of color, marginalized communities that bear the brunt of it. And nothing has been spoken about with that lens in mind. And so if the concept is that we're supposed to be getting intersectional in the way that we're governing this country, the conversations have not been intersectional because they've been quite simplistic. And on top of not even talking about women, which is like, if you're going to talk about gender, cis white women in particular are like the easiest ones to sort of include in the conversation. So forget anything about talking about trans issues, forget anything about talking about non-binary folks, talk about we still know that that trans folks, that two-spirit folks, that non-binary folks in Canada are disproportionately they bear the brunt. Anything that's going wrong, they're bearing the biggest brunt of whatever is going wrong. And we saw that during the pandemic, and the pandemic made everything very obvious. And so the fact that we're being told, like, we've been under a feminist government for 6 years now, the F word is really easy to say, it's a lot harder to do. So I would say that, yeah, gender has been entirely missing from the conversation. That lens, that intersectionality has been, I mean, not behind the scenes, obviously, in these situations, and we're all talking about it at dinner parties, but it hasn't been at the forefront of anything that I've seen from the parties themselves.
So in that vein, what is it that you would want to see, like in terms of issues or the conversation to ensure women and gender diverse people are included in economic recovery? Because it's true, you can have somebody who says in 2015, it's 2015, and we need to have this many women or this many diverse candidates with cabinet portfolios. But let's look at the other candidates who are also promising things. So what is it that you would have liked to hear? We only have a few more days to go before the election, right? Again, Jen, let's start with you.
What would I have liked to hear? Well, for one, I don't think we needed an election at all. I think that's widely the consensus at this point. That came up a few times during the English debate, I think, as well. But so it would have been nice, we could have skipped over all that, and we could have, potentially, implemented what was in the last budget bill, which was, in fact, a lot of very feminist stuff, a lot of like really good public policy that feminist activists have been fighting for generations. Like right now, I consider myself, like as a writer, I stand on the shoulders of a lot of women that came before me. A lot of people who aren't, like don't have visibly white skin. A lot of people who may have like physical or invisible disabilities. Like we know that like the intersections of identity inform our experiences and our politics, the personal being political. So I just, to me, I think the most important thing where we should be right now beyond the election is just at a consensus within the House of Commons. Like I just want to see every party, whether they're left, right, or whatever, working together to implement stuff. Like if nothing else, get the affordable childcare implemented, make it happen, right? Like there's billions of dollars on the table. There's buy-in and consensus across most of the provinces with the premiers that, we desperately need that in order to counteract what's being called this, she-cession. I don't really care for that term because it kind of excludes non-binary folks, but it is the reality, right? Like women, we've all been pushed out of work. Many of us have had to take out the CERB, or now the CRB, I guess it's called. Above all else, though, I'm just going to say that, if there's one demographic I can think of that's been left behind more than anyone else, it's women living with disabilities. Like the organization Dawn, I've been following their tweets a bit lately, and they're often kind of the afterthought when it comes to, in intersectional policymaking and in feminist advocacy in this country. We can't leave women with visible or invisible disabilities behind, right? Like that, seriously, like centering the people who are, the fastest, wiped off, basically, like the economic landscape the fastest, are the ones who are going to be pushed even further into poverty the fastest. So if we're ignoring them, what the hell are we doing, right?
No, excellent point. And also the whole conversation that whether or not we should be having an election now. But on the flip side, the devil's advocate, because I understand your point, like there was policies and there's a conversation that Parliament in a lot of ways was able to get things done. There were policies that you can, but on the flip side, we have been able to see what the other party leaders are about. We've been able to see what Aaron O'Toole is about, what Jagmeet Singh is about, what Yves-François Blanchet is about, what Anime Paul is about. So on that, and
What Yves-François Blanchet's about, man spread poses? I don't know. Sorry, maybe I shouldn't have said that, but had to slide that.
fair enough. So Emily, given that we have seen what all the political parties are offering, what else would you have liked to have seen to really have a more serious conversation about inclusiveness and economic recovery?
Where to begin? Um, there has been very little, if not any attention put on the working conditions of women in the healthcare system. Um, my father's family is from Haiti, and virtually the majority, I think, of Haitian women in this country, first generation women, Haitian women, are healthcare workers. They are nurses, and they are the people who've been working in the CHSLD. And they're the people often who don't even have status yet, because there was a program that was supposed to regularize the status of Haitian so-called guardian angels, right? Essential workers. And that program there's been so much bureaucratic trap around that program that very few people, if any, have been able to have permanent status in Canada through that program. And so one of the causes of feminism that doesn't necessarily make it to the mainstream often is the issue of, temporary foreign workers and people who are just unstable in this country. And they are often women of color, often Black women who are there to do the care work. And we've had a lot of conversation around care in this pandemic, but somehow I know that here in Quebec, even when the François Legault was putting out ads thanking essential workers, their faces were whitewashed, and more often men than they are in reality. It's like, I don't know if there's an unconscious fear that if you portray health workers as they actually are, the public with a capital P will stop empathizing with their plight. And so that, I think, is a conversation that needs to be had. I remember last year during the pandemic when the Canadian Army had to come in and assess what was going on in the long-term care house. Suddenly, their report was listened to, because when it was women of color who were saying exactly the same thing, which is it doesn't work, because they weren't doctors or because they weren't Canadian soldiers, their voices did not matter. And so that is something that really irked me. Of course, your question is a little bit of a trick because there's so many things that we haven't spoken about, and they're just like every feminist issue under the sun should have made it to the campaign. But that's maybe one that comes to mind that feel like haven't been highlighted, and there was the political momentum for it was all there. There's absolutely no, like, if we're that's I feel like highlighting this one because I feel like if we did not talk about that now, I don't know when. Like, I don't know when it will be more quote unquote timely to talk about that issue than it has been given the year that we've been through.
And this issue of who's been left behind and who's not, who's been forgotten in this whole conversation, when the politicians in this time of what they would call reckoning for all these communities, for whatever reason, given the events in the past 18 months or so, regardless of the pandemic, there has been this conversation from the politicians or even from organizations. We need to do better. We need to be more inclusive. I think we're starting to understand. And then during the election campaign, certain things are not being talked about. So in that vein, Arvin, if you can share your insights of what you feel should have been talked about when you talk about inclusiveness and the economy and recovery.
One of the things that I think was brought up earlier was the increase in gender-based violence and violence against women. And there's another sort of talking point that I find a bit, which I think is related, that I find a bit interesting that is not at the forefront of this conversation either, is defunding the police and that in its relation to gender-based violence, because we know that the police do not protect women, especially Indigenous, Black, trans, mentally ill, and disabled women. And we know that we've had an increase in violence against these communities over the course of the pandemic. And a lot of the social change that we're feeling and a lot of the momentum that we've had, we must remember that an instigator for a lot of that was Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd, and that absolutely fundamentally changed our system. So to not sort of highlight that movement, and which is a feminist and inclusive and intersectional movement that often does talk about women and other all of the genders as part of the work, and is a movement led by Black and trans women. I find that, that conversation, I find a bit odd that connection also hasn't been made, and that in general the concept of defunding the police is not at the forefront of any party conversations, because I think the concept of defunding the police is incredibly important to the conversation about gender, and is particularly important, as I said, for Indigenous, Black, trans, mentally ill, and disabled women. So that one would have been
Interesting.
pertinent.
Yeah, very interesting point. And I'm curious because, in Quebec will be in the middle of municipal elections, and, police funding, a lot of it is tends to be more of a municipal issue, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that conversation cannot be had in terms of police, in terms of community, in terms of how we do better.
Well, the RCMP is,
yeah,
they were created by the Canadian government to, I lived in Nunavut for 4.5 years, and the only police there are the RCMP, and they're federal, and in a lot of Indigenous communities, it is the RCMP that were specifically given red coats to be intimidating, so they looked like British soldiers. So, they're not doing any better. So, and it's a top-down thing. You can't separate. The federal leaders can't be like, oh, well, that's not our problem. No, everything's your problem. If you want to be the prime minister, everything is your problem.
You make a very, very valid point. So we want to drill down to specifics to some of the things you've already touched upon, and then we're going to throw a couple of these questions to each of the panelists. So Jen, again, we touched upon gender-based violence, but if we can drill down a bit more, we know that violence against women and gender-based violence there's calling it epidemic levels before the pandemic, and just really only increased during COVID. I spoke to one woman who described it as like a pressure cooker situation. It was that bad. So if there's anything else you want to add in terms, how are the parties addressing these issues during the election, and our national plans to combat gender-based violence and violence against women under discussion?
Sure. Sorry, can you hear me okay? I'm always concerned I'm not gonna unmute myself correctly. I'm like picturing that Gemma Coral cartoon where like she has like the different people in the boxes. Anyway, sorry. Tangent. Tough subject. Trigger warning for anybody, survivors of gender-based violence, which is everyone I know, pretty much. I think right now, probably the most like topical and like should be newsworthy, but it's impossible for it to be fully newsworthy because the news cycle is saturated with the federal election, is the return to campuses. So right now there's undergrads and college students, tradespeople, all kinds of folks who are just getting back onto campus or arriving for the first time in their post-secondary career after many of these like billion-dollar institutions have been closed for close to 2 years. And we know that, gender-based violence, rape, sexual assault, many of these things occur, it's basically the perfect storm for Osh Week. Like the first week, I know I've done it, okay? Like I did it myself, we all do it, everybody parties their first week or two of school. But but it's also, you know, it's a breeding ground. It's a dangerous place in a lot of cases. It doesn't have to be, but it's an issue that has definitely been eclipsed by the federal campaign since, like, during this RIP period. It's really unfortunate, you know, the fact that this election coincided and actually overlapped, you know, with back to school. I have lots of girlfriends whose children are just, you know, either starting school for the first time or entering daycare. Again, childcare problem. We need it desperately. So anyway, just in terms of violence against women, I think definitely college campuses, you know, I mean, that's universally known as one of the worst places where that kind of stuff happens. It's happened to me. Hashtag me too. Hashtag time's up. Hashtag what's next, you know, like we have to, you know, we're at a consensus, we're at, you know, a crossroads and a turning point. And I think it's just, the debating is over. It's just, you know, it's now we're at a point where we need to push, I think personally, the budget that was just put on the table in front of the House of Commons that, you know, has a pretty good strategy to tackle gender-based violence. It's our first female finance minister. I know that to a lot of people just feels like a symbolic thing because she is a white woman, but I don't know. I like Freeland personally, and I want to see these things, you know, happen as quickly as possible.
Action.
For
Exactly.
sure.
So I know Jen was also talking about childcare, but I want to put it to you that they realized how essential the care economy was. And I don't know how many people we know, mothers who had to stay home or had to like take work from home because their kid was sick. There was COVID in their classroom, all sorts of juggling that we have seen in this pandemic. So childcare, critical to women's access to the workforce. And this has been under discussion during the campaign. But the absence of a strong investment in terms of affordable, accessible, quality childcare leaves fewer options for people and families. And so, how do we help everyone understand the importance of investing in a countrywide early learning and childcare system now, including among those who aren't affected?
So my answer to that would be that we are all affected. I don't have children of my own. I'm auntie to many. I love them all equally. But I think of the work that I do. I work in film and television, and I work also as a writer. But for film and television projects, I mostly work on film and TV that is written, produced, directed, starring women. And I'm a millennial. I'm in my 30s. A lot of the other women that are in my cohort, the women I work with, the women that I love, the women that I am friends with, are starting families. And without this childcare access, if they didn't have some support in order to have their children, they would have to choose, or I wouldn't be working for them. I would be working for their husbands. I mean, I know parents come in all genders, but we also know that when it comes to childcare, that the burden of childcare falls disproportionately to women, and especially women of lower income status. So childcare is important to everyone. If economic recovery is your thing, childcare is incredibly important to that. It's actually like cheaper for everyone if we have affordable childcare. I know that I forget what year it was, but Quebec did implement a low fee subsidized program, and the level of poverty actually went down and the level of women's employment went up. And it actually had a boost to Quebec's GDP, because for a lot of people, they're looking at, well, if childcare costs me 30 grand a year, and my job pays me 30 grand a year, or 35 or 40 or 50 or whatever, and after tax, if all my money is just going to pay for daycare, well, maybe I will choose to stay home. And no one should have to make that choice. The childcare shouldn't cost as much as somebody's salary, and they shouldn't be making the choice to stay home. If you choose to stay home for children, it should not be this sort of forced economic reason for doing it. So my answer would be that I think childcare is important for all of us. And to quote Heather Lovejoy, won't somebody think of the children? Having investing in affordable childcare, investing in early childhood education, it's also really good for the kids, because they get more out of that daycare experience, they get more out of that early childhood experience. And for all the aunties and uncles and whatever else you call the grown-ups in your life, that should be equally as important to us as to the human beings that are creating children out of the cells in their bodies.
I mean, it has been talked about, Emily, and you know the Quebec perspective on childcare. I mean, under Pauline Marois, she founded she started the $5 a day child daycare. Um, it has been talked about between the politicians that this person's offering this person's not offering this. But I'm just wondering what is getting lost in that conversation when Justin Trudeau says, we're offering this, Francois Legault says, we want this, Erin O'Toole says, we want this, Jagmeet Singh says, we're going to do this, or it hasn't been done enough. What's not being talked about?
I think what's not being talked about is the ways in which were presented the numbers for those programs, and how inherently flawed that is. And that's against the like conservative, fiscally responsible approach to most measures that are basically feminist. Is that, for example, let's take the childcare system in Quebec, because it's been in place since the late 90s. As of 2003, you see that there's more women in Quebec who are employed full time. That there's, if they would not be employed in Ontario, they are, part time. So there's just generally more women in the workforce in Quebec than elsewhere. We also have a parental leave that allows fathers to take leaves, which changes the general relationship to fatherhood. And there's a lot of research that show that when fathers are present in the first months of their child life, it changes the distribution in invisible labor and care work, which then leads to also more women being in the workforce and feeling like they can be working full time while being parents. And so all of that leads to more women paying taxes. Yet that is not included in the actual costs of childcare policies. We always talk about this as spending. And then when we analyze the party platforms of how will it cost and where are your extra source of revenue, we think of extra source of revenue as taxing the rich and whatnot. And I have nothing against that at all. But I'm just saying that we're not calculating the extra source of revenue that comes from social programs that are then if, for example, you're going to have childcare education, that means that there's also early childcare education, means that there's less social inequalities between children, which means to more children graduating down the line. It means to there's a whole lot of economic implications to it that are never factored in. And so generally speaking, we talk of investments when it comes to building roads, which are very masculine sectors of employment, and that is always never spoke about as a spending. It's spoken about as investing, right? But when it comes to investing in things that affect more women, would it be childcare, or would it be even the public service, because the majority of people in public service are women? It's always spoken about as spending. And I feel like as long as we don't get that straight, as long as even the budget officer, the parliamentary budget officer doesn't get that, and his so-called objective numbers, the methodology will always be screwed against women and against progressive policy, because the reward on those policies is always externalized in the way that we calculate the cost, the so-called cost of public policies.
Language. The language in terms of how we define.
Language is power, yes.
Language is power. So I want to keep this question also with you, Emily. What about the issue of promised affordable housing? Are they really saying the same thing, or has anyone brought a gender lens to this issue?
The answer is no. And I also think that there's a huge taboo in this conversation in Canada, because most of us have been told that buying a house is a way to build a nest for retirement. So a lot of Canadians who are homeowners don't see housing as a human right. They see it as an investment. And so we all treat commodity as, housing as a commodity, as an asset. And so if we were to make housing affordable, we would somehow start negatively impacting the people who've built, even small homeowners, who've built a strategy of buying a house as a way of it, that, you know, hoping that this house was increased in value and that would somehow generate wealth for them and for, you know, for their children when they pass it on. And so in general, we're not telling us, nobody's basically honest enough to say that if you want tenants and people who are not owning homes right now to be able to access housing and have housing as a human right, at the end of the day, we cannot treat houses and housing as a way to acquire wealth primarily, which is one of the values that have become mainstream even in the Canadian middle class. And so we're not naming things in those terms. And so obviously you have here in Montreal, you have a mayor that's supposedly progressive, but all the time actually is blocking movements to support tenants' rights because there's a lot of basically the majority of those who are elected officials in all level of governments are homeowners. And so there is a kind of a class warfare there that's not named. And obviously people who are more poor tends to be women. There's an overrepresentation of women in the people who are precarious in employment and in accumulation of wealth. That's even more the case when it comes to women who are young and women who are first or second generation, because there's been less generational accumulation of wealth as well. So all of that is there. But I'm sure, you know, whenever you see people trying to help, you know, tenants' rights or people who are trying to access the home, there's nobody who's saying that, you know, this is about wealth distribution and treating housing as a human right rather than as an asset, right? And as long as we're not going there, the people will always go to the policies that are looking helpful, but are not changing the fundamental rules of the game. So that 5 years from now, we're going to be in the exact same point that we are now.
Well, it also makes you wonder the people who did buy the home now, if we had a different way of like a conversation, the people who did buy a home, try to buy a home now as an investment, there are people who can't even buy that home now. So it makes
exactly.
me wonder where, like, had we changed that conversation, could things have been different for people who can't even find even a place to rent, even if they don't want a home, maybe they want to put their money somewhere else or whatever it is. It's very interesting points in terms, again, language, conversation, the way we
yes.
frame. Anuba, anyone making meaningful commitments to addressing systemic barriers such as racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism? I know we touched upon it, but has anybody really, we hear them say the words, right?
They definitely know the words. I always think it's important to look at actions versus like platforms. And this is such a broad concept. And I was talking to my best friend, and I call him my political, like, not advisor, but like he's like my secret professor who, like, we talk a lot about politics, and I learned so much about him. And the one thing that really jumped out about for both of us, that's very recent, about actions versus, you know, the words in their mouths, was about what happened with Nunavut's only MP, Mumilak Kakap, who had decided not to run. Mumilak was the Mumilak's speech was, when she decided that she was going to step down, was, I think, very widely viewed. I hope people got to see it. If you didn't, you probably should. What she was asking for was everything that she should have been asking for. She was asking for affordable housing in Nunavut, in a place that, you know, is desperately in need of housing amongst, and also talking about the suicide rates, and also was talking about her own experience as a member of parliament who was constantly being chased down by security and asked to, like, show her badge because she is a brown woman working in, and she said, "I do not belong here." And what I think about that is the fact that the NDP, Jagmeet Singh and the NDP, they gave her leniency when she needed to take time off work. They supported her. They backed her. they stood by her even when she was critical of the system in which that she was representing, even when she was critical of the entire the House of Commons, which includes Jagmeet and the NDP. They continued to support her, and she fulfilled her term. She said, "I will not run for re-election. However, I will fulfill my term, and I'm not done yet." And I compare that to, say, what happened with Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott, and also with Selena, the MP from Whitby, Selena Cesar Chavanis, who actually quit the Liberal caucus and sat as an independent for the rest of her term. And what does that say about the values and the commitment of a party? If you say, in particular, we've all been talking about reconciliation, and I think the concept of truth and reconciliation very much encompasses that intersectional lens, because the TRC is quite intersectional in the way that the recommendations are made. If you are valuing and committing to all those words of diversity, I mean, let's look at how people keep house, right? Let's look at how you treat the people within your own caucus, within your own community, your colleagues. And I would say that the example with Mumilak Kakak shows that at least that party, at least the NDP are putting their, they're walking the
walk.
talk, they're walking the walk, they're talking the talk, and they're walking the walk at the same time. They are putting their values first, and they're putting their people first. So yeah, that would be my answer for that one.
Very interesting. Jen, I'm actually doing an interview with somebody to talk about the record number of Indigenous candidates in this election, 77. But have we really seen any Indigenous-focused, gender-based analysis in this election in terms of what's being discussed, what's not being discussed, and what needs to be talked about with regards to truth and reconciliation and decolonization?
Wow, that was a really hard question.
All of them are really.
Yeah, I'm getting like lost in the cornfield. Like anyway, like Tina Fey talked about. Anyway, tangent again. I don't know. A lot's missing. There's no like magic wand. There's no overnight fix that's going to, give everyone what they need. We all have, our own standpoint and our own lived experiences, and there's never going to be like a government that's going to magically like undo centuries of colonization and violence. Like we know this stuff already, right? But I would say that in my lifetime, at least, I don't know that I've ever heard the level of nuance in terms of language, even though it has been an extremely short campaign. It's a really, really tight rip period. I think that it's the social, political, and economic appetite for truth and reconciliation is such that it's virtually impossible for any party to get away with some of the BS that's happened in the past under, I won't say the name, but different governments than the one that we currently have. Obviously, there's a lot that remains to be seen and needs to happen, but I think we're at least at a unified consensus in this country, that we can't just use buzzwords and say certain things. We have to, treat the nations that preceded Canada by a very long time, as sovereign and independent of this state and, equal sharers of power, right? Similar to the way that the Quebec sovereigntist movement operated, right? Like that was, and I will say, without naming names, that was one thing that pissed me off more than anything, I think, during the debates. And I think like the face-à-face on TVA as well. Quelqu'un, I won't say his name, but he, I think he's searching for a raison d'être for that party, for the Bloc. Okay, I said it. And I think he's grasping for straws. He needs a raison d'être. He needs a reason to, be a party and to have people follow him. There's a lot of great people in his caucus, smart young millennial women, and but yeah, I'm sorry. The Indigenous nations that preceded Canada and the province of Quebec, yeah, no, not comparative to the province of Quebec. It's not the same thing. We won't go there. Long story short. But anyways, just I think it's a good place. This is something that I think we can look forward to collectively. I think that, this government in particular understands negotiation, nation to nation conversations. We even have a Minister of Indigenous Services who speaks Mohawk. That's never happened ever. So yeah, sorry for the long rambly answer, but it's a hard question, and I'm no expert. So
Well, and whoever forms government, I know these conversations were promised in 2015 that we get these conversations, but I think regardless of the criticism of the current government or the incumbent government, because we're in the middle of an election, these are things that take time to change. There has to be more of that willingness and
yeah.
the action, and it takes.
Like I said, there's just no magic wand. There's no magic wand. You can't please everybody. Yeah. Oh, but I will say, and just give a quick shout out to the new National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. She is a woman. Look her up. She's on Twitter. Maybe I'll put her handle in the chat bar if people are curious about her. That is also an enormous sign of progress, and it's pretty exciting. So.
And the Governor General, although it's.
No, that I defend her to the ends of the earth. I think that was an awesome choice and appointment. Personally, I'm no expert. I don't speak Inuktitut, but I think that meant something to a lot of people.
So I do want to wrap up with a closing question on representation. So at the end of the day, we have 4 presumably cis hetero men leading the federal parties with 1 Black woman leader who has inarguably faced an uphill political battle to get to this point. How much does representation matter in who the leaders are? Anubin, do you want to take that question? We'll start with you, Anuba, sorry.
I mean, at this point, we're not going to get. We don't really have a ton of representation. It is better than, it is a more diverse category, sort of situation of candidates than you would see, in the election that probably more people watched the debate. More Canadians probably watched the American debate than watched the Canadian ones, for good reason. The Canadian ones there was a lot of over talking. They were very boring. But for me, what I'm learning, from the work that I do and looking into politics and everything, it's like, I don't necessarily need somebody to look exactly like me to be able to empathize with me, because I've spent my entire life like watching white people on television and understanding what their pains and gains were. I think it's very possible. What I would be looking for, rather than sort of like visual representation, is probably at this point like that empathetic representation, the concept that they understand and really, really and truly are committed to values and changes and investments that don't even directly benefit them or people who look like them, but they're doing it because they think it's important. And that's the sort of representation I need. It's sort of like representation, not so much in physicality, but more representation in terms of action and philosophy.
Emily, in terms of representation, how much does representation matter in who the leaders are?
I think the case of the Green Party, and I wish there was a book written about that after all of this is over, tells us a lot about what works and what doesn't work in representation. What doesn't work is when you have representation in the front lines, but you don't have that following behind you or around you. And it seems to be exactly what happened with the Green Party. There was a Black woman Black Jewish woman elected as leader, and the party was not ready for that. And the caucus of the Green Party was noyauté, or filled with people who were not ready for that. So diversity in front of the camera with no diversity behind the camera is a trap. Is a trap for the voters, but it's mostly a trap for the person in front of the camera. That's what you call the glass cliff, right? When the person is set for failure because you're only looking at the spokesperson and you're not looking at the organization in general and whether or not it's diverse and whether or not it has values that are based on the intersectional analysis of society. And so I think that's what this story tells. I'm not interested in only looking at the diversity of, say, women who are ministers in a caucus. I want to have the analysis of how much money they actually control. And so if in the provincial government, finances, treasury, education, and healthcare is controlled by men plus the prime minister, you might have women responsible for whatever. That's not even a real ministry. But that doesn't make it equitable in terms of representation. If you don't have any chief of staff that are women, I'm not sure how those ministers are actually treated internally in those meetings that were not private to see. So yeah, I think if we're going to have conversations about representation, they need to be at that level. And also we need to understand that representation is really not revolution.
And chief of staff are key positions. They're very key roles.
Absolutely. All staffers are.
Yeah.
And senior public service and all of that. And when you have Black people, Black women suing both the Ontario and the Canadian public service for discrimination in the workplace, then you're saying that it's still a problem, even at the bureaucracy level as well. And one woman running for leadership of a party is also cannot save all of that, change all of that. The question needs to be asked at more complex levels than just this.
Your insights in terms of Janet, in terms of how much does representation matter in who the leaders are?
I don't know if I can really add anything else. These two women have said it all. That was I like that quote that Emily just said, just representation is not revolution. It's not, like women of color are not potted plants. They're not, stage props. They're human beings with thoughts and independent ideas. And anyway, I just, I would just echo everything that was already said.
I do want to bring my insights. It's something I have observed, and then I think we can wrap up. Everybody was talking about this exchange in the leaders' debate. In the first question to the Bloc Québécois leader about two pieces of legislation, and that the moderator had said was discriminatory and that Quebec had a problem with racism. And there was a big exchange, and the whole conversation tended to be about that day and the day after. How does this whole exchange in the evening of the debate change the game of Quebec in the context of in the context of the federal election, because Quebec is a game changer? And for me, and then during the whole day in the newsroom, we were hearing all the politicians talk, the majority of them, all the political pundits, the majority of them don't look like us, weighing in how this whole thing was. But then at the end, we were getting emails from the World Sikh Organization. We were getting emails from the Muslim organizations feeling no politician has spoken for me. They felt like they were lost. They felt like they were lost in that conversation, that the whole thing was about English, French, Quebec bashing. You can understand some of the nuances and how the question was framed, but there was something lost, like the Muslim woman who can't be promoted because of what she wears, or the Sikh man who speaks 3 languages and has to tell his son growing up in Quebec, you can't be a police officer. Just to sum it up there in terms of representation, if there's anything, I felt that I kind of got a sense that that part of that conversation was lost. If anyone wants to weigh in, Emily.
I just finished writing 1,800 words on that. So, I mean, I have a lot to say, but yes, invariably, I feel like a lot of the time in Canada, one of the reasons we don't talk about women's issues in this campaign, and also people of color and Indigenous peoples as well, is that, and not just, I'm not just talking about this, in general, a lot of airtime is sucked by debates around which is the best colonizer, the French or the British. And whenever that's like, who's the best plantation owner, like whenever that's the debate, everybody else, human rights get lost, or we're just, whipping or tokens. Or one metaphor I like to use is like, there's this hockey game between the Canadians and the Maple Leaf, and like, I'm the puck. And so I don't know how that's helpful. Now, there are ways in which people trigger that, and they see the trigger and they're happy to just go there. And that is something that makes me really emotional, because I'm like, you knew this would be the reaction. Like, you must have known. And now everybody else has to then get back into this mess. And this is all precious time that it's not spent focusing on our issues. But yeah, I feel like really frustrated
A
about
whole segment
whenever.
could have been dedicated to explaining this legislation, the English French divide. The whole segment could have been, we could have had a broader conversation as opposed to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's not going to change until we change diversity in the media in general.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jen, Jefferies, Emily, Nicolas, Annabelle Bowman. You all had very insightful things to say, a lot of things to think about, especially for people who haven't decided and haven't cast their ballot yet, and people who are politically engaged or work with different organizations to make real change. Thank you all for your insights. Thank you so much to the audience and the panelists again for up for debate. And we hope this got you all thinking about women's rights, gender justice when it comes to this election. And we'll see you at the polls September 20th. And some of us will be working after that. Thank you so much, all of you.